Welcome to the Metro Board of Directors meetings for December 10th, 2020. As this is our first public meeting of the day, I'll turn now to our Chief Safety Officer, Teresa Empasado, to begin with our safety contact. Ms. Empasado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's safety contact focuses on protecting yourself from home fires this season. Home fires occur most often during winter, and the National Fire Protection Association and U.S. Fire Administration have many resources available to educate the public on fire prevention. Heating and cooking result in the most winter home fires, according to the USFA. Ways to reduce fire risk include stay in the kitchen when you're frying, grilling, or broiling food. If you must leave the kitchen, even for a short period, turn off the stove. Keep space heaters at least 3 feet away from any item that can burn. Check electrical cords often and replace any that are cracked or damaged. Never use your oven or stovetop to heat your home. They're not designed for this purpose and not only can be a fire hazard, but also a carbon monoxide hazard. Keep real Christmas tree stands filled with water at all times and place the tree at least 3 feet away from any heating source. For more information about keeping your loved ones safe from home fires this season, visit www.nfpa.org. That concludes today's safety contact.
Thank you, Ms. Empasado. And again, welcome everyone to today's board's activities and meetings. We're beginning with the Executive Committee meeting this morning. Since this is the first meeting of the day, I'd like to ask the Board Corporate Secretary, Jennifer Ellison, to call the roll. Ms. Ellison.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg.
Present.
Vice Chair Gideby.
Present.
Vice Chair Goldman.
Present.
Alternate Director Rouse.
Present.
Director Letourneau.
Present.
Alternate Director Meridian.
Present.
Director Slater.
Present.
Director McMillan.
Here.
Alternate Director Aguirre.
Present.
Thank you. Alternate Director Bolger.
Present.
Alternate Director Alcorn.
Present.
Alternate Director Graham. I believe he's with us, just on mute. Alternate Director Costa.
Present.
Alternate Director Graham. I think you're on mute, sir. Okay, he's here. So thank you. You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Now we will begin today's meeting. Our first order of business is to approve the agenda. If there are no objections, we'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections by the committee members? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Next, now we'll move to the approval of the minutes. We have minutes from our November 19th meeting and November 19th executive session before us for approval. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. Thank you. So now we have 2 items on today's agenda. The first is the board's annual internal controls training. The training will provide a specific focus on the board's oversight responsibilities to provide the board with the tools needed to exercise those responsibilities and provide appropriate direction to management. Today's presentation will also provide an update on the upcoming Federal Transit Administration's triennial review of Metro. The second item requests approval of an update of updated Metrobus guidelines. These guidelines were last updated 20 years ago. So updating the guidelines will allow us to take advantage of the tremendous advances in data collection and analysis to help the board make more thoughtful decisions regarding Metrobus service. While it may seem counterintuitive to be updating service standards when Metro is staring down a $500 million funding shortfall for next year, these guidelines will help Metro plan and prepare.
Current regulatory requirements that relate to internal controls and are in fact applicable to Metro. We'll also discuss our board oversight responsibilities by talking through the 5 components of internal control from our coastal internal control framework, as well as the 17 principles laid out by that framework. And as the chairman mentioned, we'll wrap up our discussion with an information item about the FTA triennial review and the compliance readiness efforts that are currently underway. So let's move right into our definition. On your screen, you will see the formal definition for internal controls. Some key concepts are highlighted by this definition, and we can talk through those. Internal control is a process. A process itself denotes a ongoing task series of activities, which means internal controls is not a means to an end. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. Another item highlighted by the definition, internal control is effected by people, starting with the board of directors. So it's not merely about the policies or the procedures manuals, the systems of forms that basically constitute internal controls, but it's about the people and the actions that they take every day at different levels within the organization. Internal control is able to provide reasonable assurance, which is quite different from absolute assurance. So reasonable assurance already denotes there or really acknowledges the limitations of internal controls. A very important concept though is that internal controls is everybody's responsibility. Again, starting with the board. Regardless of who we are within Metro, we all have responsibilities for internal controls. We have different levels of accountability, different roles, but we certainly have a collective responsibility for internal controls. Some other concepts that are not as apparent in the definition, internal controls are adaptable, flexible in nature. They can apply at the entity level, they can apply at individual departments, processes, or areas. They can also apply to a subdivision of an organization, so very flexible. Internal controls have different types, so they could be what we call hard or soft controls. So an example of a hard control would be like a lock on a door. An example of a soft control would be like a written document or written procedure or policy, like a code of conduct, for example. Internal controls could vary in their precision or expected precision. An example would be verification necessary, which would require a different level of precision than a recalculation, for example. Controls could be directive in nature. An example will be a board mandated policy, which would be a directive. Controls could be preventive in nature. An example of that is the capital prepayment review process within our SBPM organization, where they review to ensure compliance with cost principles prior to making vendor payments. That's a preventive control. Controls could also be detective in nature. An example of that could be reviewing an access log from the prior month, for example. Controls can also at times be corrective in nature. I think one of the values of internal controls is right there in the definition as well, which is that it's geared towards the achievement of objectives. So what we're really saying here is that internal controls, if we have clearly defined business objectives or performance objectives, and we can clearly identify the risks to meeting these objectives, while internal controls are properly designed and properly placed in operation, they provide that reasonable assurance that our objectives are carried out. They help ensure the necessary actions are taken to address risks to the achievement of an organization's objectives. Control activities should be performed at various stages within the organization, and they, of course, should include controls over technology. Controls should come in various forms. We talked about the different types of controls earlier. They could be preventative, detective, they could be manual or automated. The important thing is that we have a good range of controls across the organization. So as we think about the three principles of that component, these board responsibilities shown here are expected of the board. The board is expected to provide oversight to management in developing performance and control activities. The board is expected to ensure or really inquire of management about the selected controls, how those controls were developed, and how they've been deployed across the organization, all responsibilities of the board. Our next component is the information and communication, our fourth component. Information and communication involves the identification, capture, and communication of data and pertinent business information in a form and time frame that enables an organization's people to carry out their responsibilities. Communication includes the manner in which information flows up and down throughout the organization, as well as information to external parties. There is an expectation that employees receive a clear message from senior management about expectations. This component also addresses information that's inbound and outbound, as long as it's necessary to conduct the business of the organization. So the three principles in that component refers us to these responsibilities for the board. The board should communicate direction at the top, provide that tone which drives the organization. The board should also allow upward communication of issues so that the board is open to communication and receiving information from the management as well. The board should examine information that's released by the organization as well as analyze that. All things that are supported by management actions as well. So our final component, the fifth one, monitoring activities, helps ensure that internal control continue to operate effectively. It involves the assessment of by appropriate parties, and of course, within a suitable time frame. This component requires an ongoing and separate evaluations that they take place. And also when they have deficiencies or exceptions noted, the board should ensure that that information is considered and resolved. So let's talk about the very specific board responsibilities that relate to control to monitoring activities. This is one that I'm sure the executive committee is very familiar with because of their responsibility for audits with the Office of Inspector General, as well as our external audit function as external auditors for financial reporting as well. So the board, from a oversight responsibility standpoint, is expected to oversee and assess the nature and scope of monitoring activities, ensure and be informed about management overrides when they occur, ensure that management is evaluating and responding to deficiencies. Um, Also, the board is expected to evaluate the results of external audit partners as well. So as we wrap up our discussion about board training, board oversight responsibilities, as we wrap up our training comments here, a final thought is, are we asking the right questions when it comes to internal controls? So at this time, I'd like to direct the committee's attention to our information item, which is the upcoming FDA triennial review. On our next slide, we have information on the FDA triennial review. This review was designed to assess management's practices and program implementation to ensure that FDA programs are administered in accordance with FDA requirements and to confirm that these programs are meeting the desired objectives. The review occurs every 3 years, as the name implies. The last one that we had here at Metro was in fiscal year 2017. The committee may recall discussions about this last December when we received our initial notification on October 31st, 2019. Since then, in March of 2020, FDA made us aware of a schedule change due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have then since received, as of October 20th of this year, a notice from FDA that the review would resume. And the on-site portion of this review will be conducted virtually, and that's now scheduled for February 2021. With the communication that FDA offered us in October, we were also notified that this review will now include a verification that the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan has been completed here at Metro, same as other recipients, and also will have a limited assessment of how Metro has used CARES funds to ensure compliance with as expected. Our next slide talks about the 21 possible focus areas within FDA's review. So the triennial review will consider basic requirements, which are the minimum requirements we're expected to comply with when it relates to a director law or regulation, a circular, a master agreement, or other binding guidance. The review would also cover indicators of compliance in these 21 possible areas. The details of this FDA review and the related areas were also provided to you in your board materials. In addition, one of the things that we've done as the internal compliance function, the Management Audits Risk and Compliance Group, in preparation for this upcoming review, has initiated and is currently conducting a compliance readiness assessment, which is pretty much based on the FDA Triennial Review Guide manual, which includes basically all what FDA would evaluate when they arrive. So we are doing a pre-assessment in preparation for that review. This assessment will provide management with the opportunity to self-identify gaps in compliance and implement corrective actions in advance of FDA's review. Compliance readiness efforts would also include the 2 areas FDA has notified us as of October would be included in their review when they come on site in February 2021. So our last slide here outlines the outlines the fiscal year 2020 triennial review timeline through the scheduled on-site review in February 2021. Our next timeline milestone is in December 31st of this year, when we're required to deliver to FDA all the recipient information requests related documents. And right now we are on target to deliver all those documents on time to FDA. We understand from our assigned reviewer that preliminary management discussions will begin as early as January. Our department will continue to facilitate those efforts, and we are the point of contact and will continue to work with FDA's assigned reviewer. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my presentation, and at this point, I'll be happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This is maybe a rhetorical question, and I think one of your last comments maybe answered this, but are you and your team going to be solely responsible for this? And if so, and then how do you interact with other parts of the organization in this review?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the entire organization technically has responsibility, but you are right. We are responsible to help facilitate the review from the external audit liaison perspective. So we're helping facilitate the collection of information as requested by FDA. On behalf of the general manager, we're making sure that we're being responsive, timely, and providing that information to FDA to facilitate their review. Since we have a fully virtual review this year, we'll also be scheduling those virtual reviews and ensuring that those that FDA's reviewers need to speak to are available for those review exercises.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll open it up for questions and comments. Ms. Gideby?
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to request regarding the compliance readiness assessment, since that has been completed, where do we fall? Are we 100%? Should we be expecting a good review?
Thank you for that question. It's going to be, yes, we are still wrapping that process up. That's actually going to take us through the end of this year. So we're about 3 weeks out to our timeline. We're about 71% completed in our pre-assessment. Just to make a note, we started before with this shift in FDA's timeline. In October, we received what they call a supplemental request to enable the virtual review. So that added an additional layer to items that needed to be pre-reviewed as well as delivered to FDA. So we expect to have a summary report of our activities by the end of this year, assessing management's readiness. And we believe that we would have that information available to the board if you would like that information.
Okay, and of the 71% that we've completed, have there been any flags?
We have not noticed anything of significance. We still have some items that are pending. We have documents that we're awaiting. FDA has asked us for some specific contracts as part of their procurement review. We're pulling some of those documents ahead of time, making sure that they have that information. We have not noted any major exceptions. We have some comments and questions out to management that we're expecting resolution on, but the whole commitment was to, if we were to find issues, to allow management time to correct that before FDA. We have not found anything of significance.
Okay, and in our previous triennial review, after it was completed, were there issue areas still open that were identified for us by FDA?
Another very good question. We did have some items that were identified by FDA, though minimal. All of those items were closed by FDA formally based on their verification of compliance. Part of our readiness assessment was also, because we're taking a risk-based approach to this, so one of the things that we consider as part of that effort is to consider prior areas of deficiencies. So as part of our process, we consider those as well. So we don't expect to see any issues because based on what we've laid out, what FDA has laid out in terms of its expected review procedures is exactly what we've pre-assessed and used as the criteria for our review. We have not noted any exceptions in those areas either.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gideby. Mr. Goldman.
Yes, Ms. Sullivan, thank you for your report. I just have a few questions about the triennial review to get a better understanding of that. Who exactly conducts the review? Is it done by employees of the FTA or outside contractors?
So FDA would typically assign an outside contractor. Ours has been assigned, and it's the same one we were assigned the last time, the earlier time before it was rescheduled. So it's the same contractor.
And is there a certain office in FTA that's responsible for the triennial review that reviews the work of the contractor?
That is correct. The regional Region 3 office has an oversight team that's responsible for that.
So it would be done through the region rather than through main FTA in downtown DC.
That is correct.
Okay. And for the final report, you had a to be determined, 2DB. What's the timeline as to when the triennial might be finished? When would you expect that we would get a report?
Okay. So that is another good question. Because of the virtual nature, some things are somewhat to be determined. Going from our last experience in 2017, after FTA conducted the review, before they left, we had our preliminary sense of findings. So we were able to have that information even before they walked out the door with an exit conference. 30 days after that, we received a draft review, and I believe that's typical. That draft review report, we had 30 days to respond to that.
I'm sorry, you didn't come across that clearly. There was little communications. When would we actually get a written report after the site visit? I think you were trying to answer that, but I didn't hear the answer.
I apologize. Communication issues here.
Yeah.
Based on our last experience,
We can blame Zoom or Microsoft.
it's always based on our fiscal year 2017 experience in normal times. We received a draft report. It was about 30 days after their exit conference.
So we would expect to get a draft report April or May at the latest. I think that's what you're saying this time.
We would expect that, but again, with the virtual nature, things may change. We've been made aware of that. I would say, again, from our last experience, at the end of the exit conference, which we expect in February 2021, once it's confirmed, we were aware at that time their preliminary findings. So we'll have a general sense of their issues at the time.
So you'll come back to us with that report after the site visit and after the exit interview with the preliminary findings?
We can absolutely do that if the board wishes. Yes.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Mr. Rouse, and I'll point out for the record, Mr. Rouse is an alternative director, and he is filling in for Mr. Horner all day today. So wanted to put that on the record. Mr. Rouse.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I believe Stephanie asked the great question I was going to ask about previous recommendations. I can tell you firsthand, there's nothing more infuriating when we conduct an audit, especially safety audits, that there's been something that's been sitting out there for 3 years that hasn't been resolved. And so that's always one of the first things I look at personally when we do safety audits. So I appreciate that question, the response to that. So thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Mr. Letourneau.
Nothing for me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Mr.
presentation.
Meridian. Thank you. Mr. Meridian.
No questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Secretary Slater.
Good morning. No questions, but I do have one request, Ms. Sullivan. So I'm relatively new to the board, only a year. Would it be possible for me to get a copy of the last triennial report? Just it might help me as we to kind of read through that as we come into this one and start to review that one as well.
Absolutely, Mrs. Slater. We can get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McMillan.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Thank you. I'll also note that this session today is part of a training. So we, as people may have heard earlier, we're joined by our alternate directors. We'll give them an opportunity as well to ask questions or state any comments. Mr. Aguirre. I'll come back. Mr. Bolger.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Tom. Mr. Alcorn.
No questions, Mr. Chairman, for me.
Thank you. Mr. Graham. I believe Mr. Graham is with us, but he may be on the phone.
No questions.
Oh, you got
No
it. There,
questions, Mr. Chairman.
there you are, Tom. Thank you. And Mr. Costa, good to see you. Mr. Costa.
Thank you.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Tony, how are you?
I'm great.
All right. Mr. Gary? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan. We obviously look forward to that report. We know how important it is, and in advance, thank you for your efforts, and we'll be seeing you come the new year. So, and at this time too, we want to thank the alternates for joining us and going through that training. We appreciate it, and we'll be saying goodbye now to those folks. So thank you. Take care. Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Appreciate it. Okay, next we have an action item, and it is in regard to the Metrobus guidelines. There is a fairly lengthy presentation, and then we'll go into Q&A as we normally do. So I'll turn it over now to Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Again, my name is Tom Webster. I'm the Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management at Metro. I'm pleased to return to the committee with the final Metrobus service guidelines for your consideration and approval today. In September, I presented the draft Metrobus service guidelines, and in October and November, staff coordinated with and has gathered feedback from Metro's funding partners, as well as the region's local bus providers to finalize those guidelines. Service guidelines are really the baseline of bus planning and monitoring, and are the framework for how service decisions are made. They prepare us for the future, allow us to think beyond the current urgent needs required by the pandemic, and to evaluate and build the bus system that works for our customers and for the region. The guidelines also give us tools to compare and contrast similar service, helping staff, stakeholders, and the board deliver more equitable service. Updating the service guidelines was one of the recommendations within the bus transformation project, and one of the 10 recommendations the board identified for action in January of this year. These new guidelines will bring Metrobus in line with our peers, including every local bus provider in the region, as they've all updated and adopted new guidelines in recent years. The guidelines, the targets, and the process to assess the quality and equity of Metrobus service is really a significant step forward from what was developed in the late 90s and adopted in 2000. So in October, Metro staff convened meetings with the local bus providers and the JCC, the Joint Coordinating Committee, to review the draft guidelines and the targets. All of the jurisdictions participated in those efforts and provided comments on the draft documents. Overall, the jurisdiction's feedback was very positive, with support for updating the Metrobus guidelines and to ensure that the measures are reflective of the customer experience and go beyond just simply service productivity. There's also discussion about how the targets will be applied going forward, how the results will be shared, and what and how the guidelines may be used to inform future service planning and future budgets. So Metro's new bus service guidelines are in many ways aspirational. Adoption of the guidelines is not intended as a commitment that every bus route meet every guideline. Instead, applying the guidelines will allow Metro, the jurisdictions, and the board to identify potential adjustments and improvements, including changes to service, and importantly, potential capital investments to prioritize buses on the region's roads. Metro will also begin publishing an annual line performance report. The guidelines will be used to inform future Metrobus service restructuring efforts and support efforts to improve equity. With the guidelines now finalized, our team has applied them to last year's service plan using pre-COVID data. And the results of this application are included in that first annual line performance report. And I'll summarize some of those results this morning. So under the new guidelines, Metro will classify routes into 4 different service types: bus rapid transit, framework, coverage, and commuter, and then categorize each route into one of three density tiers. Classifying routes into these categories allows us to establish more meaningful guidelines and targets for each type of service. Service types in this final version are the same as the 4 that were presented in September. We made a few improvements based on feedback from the committee and from the jurisdictions. And I'll just highlight that first, we improved the definition of bus rapid transit to highlight the full complement of bus priority strategies that are used in BRT systems. Second, to recognize that some service in the framework service type have certain enhancements. For example, traffic signal priority or more significant customer amenities. So we added a premium service sort of subtype within the framework service category. And then third, the densities used to separate the different tiers were increased slightly to better group the types of service. So the first step in applying the guidelines is determining the service type and tier for each route and line using the definitions that I just went through on the previous slide. So on this slide, this is all the lines across the Metrobus system, and the routes in solid purple are the framework routes with the densest land uses across the region and across the corridors. Framework lines are really the core of Metrobus service and comprise almost 50% of overall service. And about half of those lines are in tier 1, the most dense tier of service. Coverage lines here are shown in gray, and they span across all of the tiers. They're the routes that go into neighborhoods and are really built to enable transfers and connections. And they comprise about 1/3 of Metrobus service. And then commuter lines are shown in pale blue. And in pre-pandemic days, they operated in peak periods on weekdays only. And again, they're spread across all 3 tiers. There's one BRT route, Metrobus route, and that's the Metroway in Virginia. So annually, Metro will reassess the lines to determine if any land use changes or major service adjustments have shifted the service to a different type or tier. So Metro's new service guidelines are grouped by customer experience, including service availability, route design, reliability and comfort, and by productivity and cost effectiveness. These guidelines, again, remain the same as the draft presented in September, with several targets and inputs adjusted and improved based on that input from the jurisdictions and feedback there. So I won't go into all the detail, but updates were made to the span of service and maximum headway targets for the BRT service type. Stop spacing targets were adjusted in the framework service type, and adjustments were made to the minimum distance between parallel corridors in the densest areas of the region. So to assess and then importantly communicate how well a line or a route is doing compared to the target for each of those guidelines, we've established a grading system ranging from A to E. So a grade of A means that the line or the route exceeds the specific guidelines target for that type and tier. B means it's meeting the target. C indicates that the line is approaching that target. And D and E mean that it's below or significantly below the target. So Metro's new annual line performance report will provide the detailed grades for each line and each route for every guideline and target listed on the previous page. So the individual guideline grades for each line were then averaged by our team to obtain an overall line score, which helps identify lines that might need some attention. So in this next slide, we show the aggregated score for each bus line across all of those guidelines. These show essentially the straight average of the underlying guideline scores for each line. So importantly, and it's sort of an example here, it's important to note that just because a line scores an A or a B doesn't mean that all of those underlying guideline scores are also A's or B's. So I'll pick an example here. The X2 that's shown in the East DC box, sort of in the middle of the screen here, has an overall grade of a B. However, looking at the detailed grades for each guideline, the X2 has an A scores for most of its guidelines, a B for load factor, which is another way of describing how many people are on the bus, and an E for on-time performance. Those lower scores on certain guidelines are for this particular route are largely due to higher ridership, congestion, and the frequency of bus stops on the H Street corridor in the district. So in aggregate, about 85% of Metrobus lines that were operating as of December of last year met or exceeded the guidelines that are before you today. The remaining 15% of lines scored C or below. And of those, 65% were framework or BRT lines, 13% were coverage, and 22% were commuter. And again, much more detailed information will be available each year in our annual line performance report. The line benefit score is another component of the service guidelines, and it helps to further differentiate the role that the different lines play in the Metrobus network. This score also helps to establish and prioritize where to focus service adjustments and potential investments in bus priority. One meaningful way to apply the guidelines is to identify opportunities to improve equity. Through public engagement and surveys conducted during the bus transformation project, bus customers told us that service reliability, on-time performance, and service span, or the hours that of operation of the service, especially in the off-peak and on weekends, are important to them. So staff, the jurisdictions, and the board can use the guidelines, the grades, and the line benefit scores to identify targeted service adjustments to improve service access and mobility for our low-income and minority bus customers. So in closing, management recommends committee and then board adoption of the new service guidelines for Metrobus. And I'd like to thank you, Chairman Smedberg and Vice Chair Kiddaby, for your support of this effort and your leadership in advancing these important steps for the future of Metrobus and our customers and the region. That concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for all your work on this. It is almost hard to believe it's been 20 years since these were last updated. So thank you for that. Obviously, very important and timely as we go into this very interesting stage for the authority. Tom, just procedurally and process-wise, explaining and goes on to the board. What is it exactly happens now? These things are being accepted by the executive committee and possibly the board as a whole. So these now will come in effect or will be the guidelines that you will use moving forward. Just sort of explain that to us so everyone is clear on that. I know we've had some questions from some of the public about that, and some of the jurisdictional staff, just so we're all clear.
Sure. The immediate first step is publication of this annual line report that shows how each route is doing relative to the guidelines and shows the route benefit scores. And really, that's an information piece for staff, for the jurisdictions, and for the board as we're evaluating service going forward.
Okay.
And then again, we're committed to refreshing that at intervals. For the benefit of service planning and for the board's decision-making process.
Okay. Thank you so much. Before we start the discussion, if I could get a motion on the table by one of the committee members, I'd appreciate that.
Motion.
Thank you, Ms. Kidby.
Second.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Letourneau. Okay.
We actually need
Ms.
a second
Gideby,
by a
I'll
committee
start with you.
member.
Good point.
Oh, committee member. Sorry.
I'll
Sorry.
second.
Michael, or is that Greg? Okay.
Yeah.
Greg.
Executive
Well,
committee
wait.
member.
Oh, executive committee member. Sorry.
I'll volunteer for the task, Goldman.
Oh, all right. There we go. We have a motion by Ms. Gideby and seconded by Mr. Goldman. All right, Ms. Gideby, questions or comments?
Yes, I just wanted to express my enthusiasm and appreciation for these bus standards. It was definitely a high priority. I think it also just helps to reprioritize bus. I want to thank also the stakeholders who last year we were approving the bus transformation study. And so it's a great joy to see us in this process and continuing to build upon the work that has been done by regional partners in discussing how we ensure that Metro bus and rail works for the region more specifically. I wanted to just go to the presentation on the slide where we talked about service guidelines, slide 7 and 8. Starting in slide 7, is it a weighted process in terms of the service guidelines that we've set up? So in terms of just availability or comfort, does one particular customer experience maybe weight more than even productivity and cost effectiveness? Or are we considering all things equal?
So at this juncture, we've weighted all of the guidelines equally for the purposes of grading. But of course, you can look at any individual guideline that may be of particular importance for a route or for those customers and evaluate that guideline on its own.
Okay. And so going back to the example that you used, the X2 as part of those pieces, what you were explaining on what is shown on slide 7 is that it is not necessarily that it was a B factor because it didn't meet everything, but in availability and in comfort, those were the two issue areas in which you would see kind of flags or concerns.
Yes, the areas of where the X2 does not meet guidelines are in essentially on-time performance and number of people on the bus or crowded buses. Yes.
Okay. And then moving forward, just thinking about this upcoming budget, I know that it is an interesting time to put forward bus standards at the same time that we're having these cuts. But as you were sharing, while this is an annual process, we can call on you all to help us to use this analysis for future decisions.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. And then I also just want to thank your team for just serving as conveners for the region and making sure that not just Metro Bus is working, but all of the bus providers are in communication and really having an understanding of the service standards that we're hoping to maintain for the region. So thank you again for your leadership on that. No further questions.
Thank you.
Good point, Ms. Gideby. Mr. Goldman, representing Maryland.
True.
On the executive.
Tom, thank you for bringing this back to the board. It gives us an opportunity to check off as completed another one of the tasks required by staff under the board's resolution approving the bus transformation study. So thank you for following up on that and bringing this forward so we could complete that task and check it off. When you were here the last time, you and I had a little conversation about whether we had a definition for what is a BRT, a bus rapid transit service, as one of the service types that you've identified among the 4 service types. Do we have that definition now as part of the guidelines?
Yes, sir. Yes, we do. And in fact, that was one based on that conversation and some follow up afterwards. We improved that definition to be more in line with what BRT systems look like nationally.
Okay. Could you just summarize what that definition is and where people can find it, members of the board, and as well as members of the providers in the guidelines?
Yeah, so it is here on this slide in very short form. So high frequency routes that have dedicated right of way and substantial transit priority measures. And then in your packet attached to the resolution, there's a document, and I may be able to find the page. I think it's on page 5 of the guidelines document itself. And it goes into, you know, a fairly lengthy description of the classification of BRT.
All right. So besides the dedicated lanes, is sort of off bus payment or limited stops also one of the criteria that we're using to define a BRT?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And could you just explain then what is the difference between a BRT service and the premium service that's the subset of framework?
Mr. Goldman, I'm not sure if it was my connection or yours. I could not hear your question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're broke up
we
there a
have
little
something.
bit.
We have something called a premium service, which is defined as under framework. And I'm just trying to understand what's the distinction now between a premium service and a bus rapid transit service.
Sure. The simplest way to explain it is the bus rapid transit has basically all of the features of bus prioritization, all of the customer amenities. What we're trying to differentiate here is some framework routes have a few of those elements, so one of the improvements we made was to differentiate between base framework service and a premium service that has some elements of what would be a BRT system.
Okay. I mean, do we have any examples of a premium framework service now in the system?
So places where we have priority treatment, so traffic signal or queue jumps or bus lanes. So for example, the H&I bus lanes in the district, that would represent, again, some elements of what would be a BRT system. It's not a full BRT system, but that's sort of an example of.
So they would be considered a premium service under the framework designation.
What about Metro?
Metroway, we are classifying as a BRT service.
BRT, yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that's goes as far as I want to go. Thank you again. You've obviously reached out to the jurisdictions and the local bus service providers, and they've agreed to this. I haven't heard any criticisms of what you're presenting today. So thank you for that consultation with the local providers and local governments. You've brought forward something that is relatively non-controversial for a change. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Mr. Ress.
Yes, and thank you certainly for this. And as Mr. Webster may have ascertained by this point, I'm not a big fan of universal service models or one-size-fits-all service models. So I think this goes a very long way in helping to not only ensure that the service we have out there fits our need, but also can be adjusted moving forward as things change. Because as you know, on the rail side, it's a fixed assets. There's not much you can do. There's only little you can do to change service. But Whereas the bus side, it's more of this amorphous model that's always changing with land development and land use, and many other circumstances. And so being able to determine what your goals are to serve an ever-changing landscape and also evaluate against those are critically important. And so I think this is a great step towards that, updating something that was fairly aging at that point in terms of 20 years old. I would say one question I did have kind of feeds off the discussion that Mr. Goldman had, and that was how did we decide to put premium in the framework side versus BRT? If you look at what you had in terms of the model spread, we really only had one BRT system out there. How did you make that decision in splitting between where you put premium level services?
I think it's I could see going either way. It's more to indicate that a framework route is beginning some steps towards BRT, but isn't yet BRT. So that's the reason for that categorization.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because you have these nice 4 models, and one seems to be very light versus all the others. So there's many ways you can split that. I was just curious on how you reached that conclusion. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Mr. Letourneau.
Yeah, I just want to thank the staff for the great work here. This is really good information. It's very helpful, and it's also much appreciated that the level of data being supplied on the bus level to the jurisdictions is happening and happening earlier. That's really appreciated, and so we're very much on board with that because it makes everybody's job a little easier. If we could do it electronically, it'd be even better. But thank you very much for all of this, and it's a little troubling, obviously, when we look at all this and then look at the budget realities that we're facing. Just kind of underscores it. But this is the type of framework stuff that we need. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to echo my colleagues. Tom, thank you to you and your team for this framework, for this great work. And the district remains committed to partnering with WMATA to improve the quality and reliability of bus service across the district and really across the region. I think we've had a great collaborative relationship as a city with the WMATA team just over the past couple of years, looking at the data from a granular level, which has helped us plan more efficiently and more effectively and help support the improvements that I know the general manager and the team are committed to. So thank you for this. Look forward to continuing to work together to make these things a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meridian. Secretary Slater.
Good morning. Just let me echo everyone else's thanks. This is really good stuff and a long time coming. I just have kind of one question. Back on slide 7, I feel like I answered the question in a later slide in the network value piece, but was there any consideration to accessibility as a metric here and in terms of kind of the performance side with all these others? I'd like to understand how much accessibility to jobs and services, those types of things along these routes was part of the conversation.
So at a high level, I'm getting an echo. Sorry. At a high level, it is one of the guidelines within the availability category. So that first one, and we can provide a little bit more detail about what that means. It's again explained in the document, but it is one of the guidelines and one of the targets that's set for each line and route.
Great, thank you. No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slater. Mr. McMillan.
All of my questions have been posed already, so thank you.
Thank you. All right, I want to thank everyone for your comments. Mr. Webster, and as everyone has said, I mean, this is really important. It has come in a long, long way. Appreciate the regional cooperation here and outreach, and hopefully that continues as we move forward with this effort. So with that said, let's have the roll call of the committee for the vote. Ms. Ellison?
Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Giddy,
Aye.
Vice Chair Goldman,
Aye.
and Mr. Rouse.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Since there is no further business to come before this committee, we stand adjourned. Please hold on just for a few moments as we transition to the Finance and Committee meeting, which will begin shortly.